Welcome back to Reflections Podcast, where we reflect on the writings of the fathers of the faith. This is our last week with Thomas Kempis. We are discussing the Soliloquies of the soul. Rolls off the tongue, soliloquies of the soul. So this week, it's a spiritual text that explores the intense and personal dialogue between the soul and God. The work is structured in a series of meditations, reflections, and prayers, revealing a profound longing for union with God. It's a deep awareness of sin and human weakness, and an unwavering focus on God's mercy and love. Thomas Kempis used a conversational, almost dramatic style, engaging the reader in an internal struggle toward spiritual purification and enlightenment. I haven't read it, so I am excited to dive into this with you, and that description just makes me all excited. I feel like I can really relate to that. So in this week's discussion, listen for these key themes and ideas. Listen for the soul's longing for God and a dissatisfaction with the world. The text opens with an explicit yearning for God. Then listen for God's ineffability and majesty. God's nature is presented as beyond human comprehension. Listen for awareness of sin and human weakness. A pervasive theme is the recognition of one's own sinfulness, our limitations, dependence on God's grace. This recognition leads to feelings of shame, unworthiness, and a desire for God's purifying grace to alleviate that shame and unworthiness. Listen for divine judgment and the fear of God. There's this emphasis on the importance of contrition, repentance, and prayer, and God's mercy, grace, and forgiveness. There's also some talk on the nature of true love and union with God. The work consistently calls for a single-minded devotion to God, warning against half-hearted and worldly distractions. There's more talk on the pursuit of perfection, the importance of inner transformation, and external actions. It is not enough to merely avoid wrong actions, but to become dead to the world, fully united to God. It's a test of true devotion and is found in one's heart, not in external appearances. The Soliloquy of the Soul is a personal reflection on the inner life of faith, highlighting the complexities of the relationship between the human soul and God. It is a text that encourages self-examination, humility, and constant pursuit of God. The themes explored are not unique, but the personal and passionate style combined with its focus on grace and repentance provides a compelling model for spiritual contemplation. The text remains relevant because it explores timeless themes such as the nature of faith, the struggle against temptation, the need for divine grace, and the longing for ultimate union with God. As we listen in on the following conversation, think about how the Soliloquy of the Soul might offer a glimpse into the profound and spiritual journey and how it might reflect parts of your own journey. The text explores the soul's longings, acknowledging human frailty, and persists in pleading for God's mercy. I'm praying the conversation is refreshing to you. Let's listen in.
All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we're diving deep into the Soliloquy of the Soul, this incredible text by Thomas Kempis.
It's a fascinating piece, really. Imagine eavesdropping on a soul bearing its heart to God.
Exactly. That's the vibe, right?
Yeah.
And we'll be tackling some weighty stuff, like judgment, earthly struggles, and that deep burning desire to connect with the divine.
It's heavy, yeah. But also so relevant. This was written in the 15th century, but those themes, that self-reflection and the search for meaning, they haven't aged a bit.
It's like looking through a window into the past, but seeing ourselves reflected back.
Exactly.
So one thing that's really clear from the start is that the soul is just overflowing with this longing for God. There's a recognition of God's greatness, but it's both awe-inspiring and a little intimidating.
It's like trying to grasp something so immense, something almost beyond comprehension. We're talking about trying to understand an infinite being, right?
And that struggle to understand, to wrap your head around it all, it's actually kind of beautifully portrayed.
You see it in that image a Kempis uses. The tiny spark trying to make sense of this vast hidden darkness. It's the soul acknowledging its own smallness.
Wow, that's powerful. A tiny spark against all that darkness.
It's a potent image, and it highlights this humility the soul has, this understanding that we're not the center of the universe, that God is the ultimate source of knowledge and revelation. We might yearn to understand him, but we recognize that we can't fully grasp his vastness.
It kind of makes you think about what life must have been like back then, in the 15th century. Life was often harsh and unpredictable.
Absolutely. Disease, war, famine, it was a different world.
Maybe that intense longing for God reflects a need for comfort and security, some kind of anchor in a world that felt so out of control.
I think you're onto something there. Even today, with all our advancements, that yearning for something bigger than ourselves that hasn't gone away. We're still trying to figure it out, to find meaning and purpose in all the chaos.
It's like that longing is just woven into the fabric of the human experience, no matter the time period. But then right alongside that yearning, there's this fear, right? This trembling before the sheer power of God.
Yes, the judgment. And the way Kempis describes it, it's so vivid, so visceral. He uses these intense images of roaring lion, a blazing fire, the earth itself trembling.
Oh, yeah. It's like you're right there experiencing it.
It's meant to evoke that sense of awe, but also that fear, that raw vulnerability before God's wrath.
You can practically feel the ground shaking beneath your feet.
Exactly. He doesn't hold back. But it's interesting, right? Because that intense focus on judgment, it's not how everyone relates to God today.
It's true. Times have changed.
There's a shift in how we view that relationship. But even if we strip away that fire and brimstone imagery, I think there's still a point here. The soul isn't just cowering, it's also acknowledging its own shortcomings. It's saying, hey, I'm not perfect. I need your mercy.
So it's about that recognition, facing our imperfections.
It's what opens the door to repentance, to changing for the better. And that desire for change, that's where we see the soul start to lament about life here on earth.
The struggles, the hardships.
The brevity of it all, the pain, the uncertainty. There's a real sense of disillusionment with those earthly pleasures. The soul's recognizing that they're fleeting, that they can't really satisfy.
And it actually seems to long for death, not in a morbid way, but as this gateway to lasting joy and unity with God. It's such a stark contrast to how we view life and death today, don't you think?
Absolutely. We're so focused on prolonging life, on fighting against aging. It makes you wonder, what if we embrace the idea that true fulfillment lies beyond the material world? What if we shifted our priorities?
That's a pretty deep thought to chew on. But if true joy is only found in God, then that leads us to this whole concept of being dead to the world.
Right. Which obviously doesn't mean literally dying.
No, of course not. But what does it actually mean then?
It's about detaching from those worldly desires and ambitions. It's about choosing spiritual growth over chasing after things that don't really matter in the grand scheme, things that won't bring true happiness.
So it's about freedom.
Yes. Yeah. Freedom from all that striving, all that pressure to achieve worldly success. It's recognizing that our worth comes from God, not from our possessions or accomplishments.
And that freedom, is that what allows us to experience that true consolation that comes from connecting with the divine?
You got it. The text describes that connection as incredibly intense, too. The soul experiences this overwhelming sweetness when it feels close to God.
Oh, yeah. And then there's the flip side, that deep sorrow when God feels distant. It's like riding an emotional roller coaster.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. And that divine sweetness, it might sound a bit abstract, but it speaks to a very real experience. It's that feeling of pure joy, of peace, of unconditional love that can come with a profound spiritual connection.
And then, that spiritual dryness, when that connection fades. It's interesting to think about this in the context of the 15th century, They didn't have all the distractions we have today.
Yeah.
No internet, no social media, no constant bombardment of information. Do you think that made their spiritual experiences more intense, both the highs and the lows?
It's a good question. It's possible that a less stimulated life could have made them more aware of their inner world, yeah? Those spiritual highs and lows might have been felt more keenly. And while we might not experience things with the same intensity, I think anyone who's ever felt that yearning for God can relate to what Kempis is describing here, that feeling of being lost and alone when he feels distant.
It's like the universal experience of longing for connection, but on a spiritual level. And it makes me think about how faith isn't always a straight line. There are ups and downs, moments of closeness with God, and then those periods of doubt.
And that's key, right? This isn't just a feel-good story about finding God. The Soliloquy recognizes how complex that spiritual journey is, navigating those ups and downs, trusting that even when things feel dark, there's a light waiting to guide us back.
So it's like those moments of dryness and doubt are just as important as those times of intense joy, and maybe they can even lead to a deeper, more mature understanding of faith.
I think so, but let's unpack that a bit more.
It's wild to think that those moments of spiritual dryness where God feels distant, they can actually be opportunities for growth. It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does, but that's what the Soliloquy suggests. And the text really captures the anguish the soul feels in those moments. It's like being thrown into this icy darkness after experiencing the warmth and light of God's presence.
It must be so disorienting.
You feel lost and confused, even abandoned. And what makes it even harder is that the soul logically knows that God is there, but there's this emotional disconnect.
Like a wall has come up between them.
Exactly, like God is hiding his face, and that seeming absence is agonizing because the soul yearns for God so intensely. Remember that analogy with the tiny spark in the vast darkness? Well, now it's like that spark has been snuffed out.
Leaving the soul alone in the void.
Yeah. It's like those times in life when no matter how hard you try to rationalize things, you just feel alone. But here it's happening on a spiritual level, which must be even more terrifying.
Definitely. And what I find interesting is that Kempis doesn't shy away from the soul expressing these raw emotions. Like there's anger there, even resentment towards God.
You don't see that too often in spiritual texts. Usually it's all very sanitized.
Right. But here, the soul is wrestling with God, demanding to know why it's been left to suffer. I think that's what makes it so relatable, even for people who aren't particularly religious. We've all felt abandoned at some point, questioned why we're going through hard times.
Exactly. It's that universal experience of suffering. And what's interesting is that the Soliloquy doesn't give easy answers. It doesn't try to explain away the suffering. It simply acknowledges it.
So how does the soul make sense of those periods of spiritual dryness then? If they're not a punishment, what are they?
The text suggests they might actually be opportunities for growth, for developing a stronger, more mature faith.
So it's like those trials and tribulations we talked about earlier. They refine us, force us to become more resilient.
You have to learn to trust, even when you don't understand. And that trust is what allows you to move through those dark times, to emerge stronger on the other side. It's about surrendering to the process, having faith that even when God feels distant, his grace is still working in your life.
Which makes me think about how much we try to avoid pain and discomfort in our modern world. But maybe, like the Soliloquy suggests, leaning into those difficult emotions, especially the spiritual ones, can lead us to a more profound connection with something bigger than ourselves.
It's a challenging idea for sure, especially in a culture that values comfort and ease so much. But it makes sense, doesn't it? Growth often happens outside of our comfort zones.
You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Sometimes those periods of spiritual dryness are like the cracking of the eggs.
I like that. And it's not just about enduring suffering. The Soliloquy also talks about actively embracing it as a path to growth and union with God.
That's intense. It's like the soul is saying, bring on the pain. I know it will bring me closer to the divine.
It is radical, and it speaks to how deep the soul's desire for union with God is. It's willing to endure anything, even suffering, to achieve that oneness. It reminds me of those mystics who would practice extreme self-denial to purify themselves and get closer to God.
Right, like they believed that physical pain could somehow bring them closer to spiritual enlightenment.
And while most of us wouldn't go to those extremes, there's still something to be said for recognizing that discomfort, even pain, can be a catalyst for transformation, especially spiritual transformation.
It's like we have to let go of our need for control, for comfort, in order to fully surrender to something bigger than ourselves. But surrender is hard.
It is. But the soliloquy reminds us that even in our struggles, God's mercy is always there, always available. It gives us the strength to keep going when we feel lost and alone. And that's where we see a shift in the text, where the soul begins to focus more on the eternal, on the hope of heaven.
It's like after wrestling with all that doubt and dryness, the soul comes out on the other side with this renewed sense of hope.
Exactly. And that hope isn't naive. It's rooted in the soul's experience of God's sweetness and the unshakable belief in his promises. It's tasted a bit of heaven, and now it craves the full experience.
And that yearning is palpable, isn't it? It drives the soul to seek God with everything it has, to strive for holiness, to reject anything that might hinder its union with the divine.
You can't really know what you want until you've tasted it. The soul has tasted heaven, and it won't settle for anything less. It's like when you experience true love, you know what's possible, and you're not going to settle for a shallow imitation.
But in this case, it's on a spiritual level, this yearning for a love that goes beyond the physical world.
And that longing can be a powerful motivator. It pushes us to grow, to evolve, to become more like the people God created us to be.
It's like that feeling of discontentment becomes a driving force, pushing us towards something greater. But it makes me wonder about those who haven't had that taste of divine sweetness. How do they connect with that longing that's so central to the soliloquy?
That's a great question. I think it highlights how important it is to actively seek out experiences that nurture that spiritual connection. Whether it's through prayer or meditation or spending time in nature or helping others, there are so many paths that can lead us to that place of deeper awareness.
So we have to be proactive, make a conscious effort to create space for those moments of connection, even if they don't always come easily. But it sounds like the soliloquy suggests that it's worth the effort.
Absolutely. Experiencing the fullness of God's love is the ultimate goal. It's the source of true, lasting happiness. And that brings us to the final part of the text, where the soul expresses its gratitude for God's blessings.
It's like this beautiful song of praise, acknowledging the magnificence of God's grace. A perfect way to end such an intense journey.
And it's not just generic thanks either. The soul specifically calls out 3 key benefits: creation, redemption, and justification.
Can you break those down for us?
Sure. Creation refers to the awe of simply existing, the gift of life itself. Redemption is the soul's understanding that it has been saved from sin and death through Christ's sacrifice. And justification is about the soul's right standing before God, not because of its own merit, but because of God's grace.
So it's this 3-part expression of gratitude, acknowledging the wonder of being alive, the gift of salvation, and the incredible unearned love of God. And it all leads to this profound act of surrender.
The soul realizes it can never truly repay God for these gifts, so it offers its entire being as a sacrifice of thanksgiving, complete devotion, complete humility.
It's like the soul is saying, "Take it all, God, I'm yours." Such a powerful way to end after all the ups and downs the soul has experienced. It leaves you with a sense of peace, of completion. It's really striking how the soul arrives at this place of complete surrender. It's like after all that wrestling and questioning, there's finally this profound sense of peace.
It is peaceful. And what's interesting is that it's not about weakness, giving up.
Yeah.
It's actually this incredible act of strength and trust. The soul is choosing to put itself completely in God's hands.
Because
it understands that's where real freedom is.
Yeah.
That's how you find true fulfillment.
It's like how we often think strength is about being self-reliant, being in control.
Right.
But the soliloquy is saying, no, true strength comes from admitting you don't have all the answers, letting go of that need to be in control.
Letting yourself be held by something larger than yourself.
Exactly. And it's not just about control. It's also about letting go of that need to understand everything. There's this acceptance throughout the text that the soul doesn't need a neat explanation for everything.
Right.
It's okay with mystery, with not knowing.
And that's such an important point, especially today.
In our world, where everyone wants information and certainty.
Exactly. But the soliloquy reminds us there's a beauty in accepting that we don't have all the answers. It's that humility that opens us up to wonder.
Makes me think about how kids approach the world, They're always asking why, but they're also totally fine with not knowing everything. Maybe there's something we can learn from that childlike sense of wonder.
Oh, I love that. It's like we need to rediscover that curiosity, that awe that we often lose as adults. And I think the soliloquy shows us how.
Yeah.
It's about approaching our relationship with God with that same kind of childlike trust.
Being open to the mystery.
Yes.
And maybe that's how we experience those moments of divine sweetness that the text talks about.
Makes sense, right.
You have to create space for the mystery, the unexpected. That's how those glimpses of the divine shine through.
It's about shifting our focus. We're so busy trying to control and understand everything.
Yeah.
But what if we just focused on being present, being receptive?
And that opens the door to a deeper connection with God.
That's the idea.
Which brings us back to that ultimate goal, right? Union with the divine.
Right.
It's not just some abstract idea in the soliloquy. The soul wants it, like with every fiber of its being.
And the way that longing is expressed, it's incredibly powerful.
You can almost feel the soul yearning to break free from those earthly limitations, to merge with that source of all love and light.
It's like a love story, isn't it?
It is. But instead of another person, the soul is yearning for something transcendent, something that truly satisfies those deepest desires.
It's a love that goes beyond time and space. And I think it's a story that everyone can connect with, because we all have that desire for connection, for belonging, for something that makes us feel whole.
And the soliloquy suggests that that wholeness is found in union with God.
It's not about being perfect or following a bunch of rules. It's about surrendering to a love so big, so all-encompassing, that it changes us completely, from the inside out.
That's beautiful. But it makes me think, what does this all mean for us, going back to our daily lives?
Right.
If the soul is searching for that home in the divine, where do we find that sense of belonging?
Maybe it's not about a specific place or achieving some state of being.
Maybe it's about that interconnection, that sense of being held and loved, even when things are tough.
Exactly.
A lot to think about. This deep dive into the soliloquy of the soul has been quite a journey.
It really has. We've explored so much.
And I hope it encourages our listeners to keep exploring these questions in their own lives.
To keep searching, keep questioning, and stay open to that mystery and wonder that's at the heart of the spiritual journey.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the soliloquy of the soul. Thanks for joining us.
And there you have it. What do you think? I am praying that no matter where you land theologically, that you are being drawn by the Spirit to engage more fully with God and find these conversations refreshing. That doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the conversation says or everything that the theologian thinks or what I think. It just means, is it engaging your mind for Christ? That's it for this week on Reflections Podcast, where we reflect on the writings of the fathers of the faith. Next week, we will be reflecting on St. Francis Assisi, and I hope that you will join us. That's it for now. Thanks. Bye.